Hi everyone, my name's Brittany and welcome back to my channel. So it's been quite some time since I've done a video, which means I'm super excited to be able to bring you this brand new sew along. This is the first video I've released in such a long time and I'm so excited because it's a sew along for my brand new pattern, the Lavande Undies. I am super excited to be bringing you all this new pattern. I am super persnickety about what kinds of underwear I'm wearing, which probably sounds really weird, but even with all the underwear patterns out there, I just felt that none of them quite fit me the way that I had hoped they would, which is why I decided to create this pattern specifically. So I'm super excited because I did both a hip hugger view and a high-waisted view. And it wasn't until recently that I actually was like, I really like high-waisted underwear. It's so comfortable, and especially depending on the day, it just feels like, it feels nice right against the skin. So for today's tutorial, I thought that we would go through sewing a high-waisted pair of the Lavandes, and I'm going to show you all how to do 3 different elastic insertion techniques, including, I forgot all of the elastics already. So I'm going to show you 3 different elastic insertion techniques, including Picot Elastic, fold over elastic, and fabric binding. If you've never worked with knits before, sewing underwear is the perfect first project because it's so low risk. No one's going to see it. If you mess up a little bit, that's totally fine, and it uses less than a yard of fabric. Plus, it's a great scrap busting option. I absolutely love taking all of my knit offcuts from other projects and mashing them together to create a really one-of-a-kind, unique pair of underwear. So if you've never sewn with knits before and you're still a little bit unsure and a little bit hesitant about diving right into this project, don't worry, I've got an entire blog series dedicated to introducing you to knits that you can find located in the links below. Haven't done this in so long. Before we get started, I wanted to note that there are tons of different ways to sew together knit garments. You don't need a serger in order to do so. In fact, all of the samples that I sew up today for this tutorial were done using my machine and using nothing more than a zigzag stitch. If this is your first time sewing anything knit, I highly recommend working with a zigzag stitch as it's the easiest one to take out in case you make a mistake or something's not fitting you properly. There are pros and cons with working with a zigzag stitch, especially when it comes to underwear, because a zigzag stitch, whereas it is stretchy, it tends to wear out the most quickly of all of the stretch stitches over time. So for your first pair, I recommend working with a zigzag stitch just to see how it goes. And then as you gain in confidence, switch it up to another stitch, such as the stretch stitch that kind of looks like a little lightning bolt on the edge of some machines, or a 3-step zigzag stitch, which gives you the flexibility of a zigzag stitch, but it's a little bit stronger because it's a series of tiny stitches in the form of a zigzag, so it's much less likely to come apart, especially when wearing something like underwear where there's a lot of stress being put on them every single day. Oh, one more thing before we get to sewing. I did mention that there were 3 different elastic methods that I was going to show you. If you are here simply for that, feel free to check the timestamps below so that you can skip ahead and not worry about any of the sew along instructions and just dive right into your preferred elastic insertion method. All right, I think that we're ready to go. If I've missed anything, I promise to mention it as we go along through the sewing tutorial. Let's get sewing. All right, so we have everything here that we could possibly need to work on this project, so I am just going to go over a couple of things with you all. For this particular pair of undies, I'm going to be using some Picot Elastic for the legs and some lace trim for the waist. But don't worry, if you are using fold over elastic or fabric binding, I will be going over both of those options as well as Picot Elastic for this project just so that you can see how each of them is attached. Then I've got my fabric. So in the instructions, I do recommend that you have fabric that has at least 40% stretch. I'm using a combination of hemp and cotton jersey fabrics from Sitka Fabrics in Canada. As far as the gusset pieces go, I always like to line mine with a nice, soft, organic cotton just because it feels really nice against the skin. But you can go ahead and use the same fabric that you cut as your gusset lining. Then of course I have some matching thread, snips, and a seam ripper in case anything goes wrong. And then as far as sewing with knits is concerned, what's really important is getting a proper needle. So right here I have a stretch needle that I'm going to be using, and I've already tested this on my knit fabrics and it seems to work really well, so that's what I'm going to be using. But if you're unsure which needle might work best for your fabrics, go ahead and grab a couple of scraps and test out a few different needles to determine which is the best for your project. I have suggestions for all of this in my Intro to Knits free blog series, which I will link in the description box below. Once you have everything ready to go, it's time to jump in and get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to start with is our front piece. We're going to attach our gussets to this piece. What you want to do is start by laying the front side of the gusset lining so that it is facing you. So this is the right side. Then you are going to put the wrong side of your front piece down here, and we are going to pin this together. This part may require quite a few pins, but that is a-okay. So we're just going to match our notches and begin pinning together. I like to match my notch first and then take this corner bit and stretch it around to the edge. There is going to be a little bit of a triangular piece hanging off, and that's okay. This is part of the seam allowance. You just want to make sure that if you were to line your sewing machine up with this part, it would catch right here at the 1/4 inch mark. Feel free to go slow here and use as many pins as you need for a nice smooth curve. Now that we have one piece pinned, the next step is to pin with the right sides touching. We're going to sandwich this in between, matching the notches just like so. And then we're going to do the same thing as before, making sure that our front undies piece is perfectly sandwiched between our two gusset pieces. In the end, it should look a little something like this, where you have lining gusset, main fabric, non-lining gusset. So now we are just going to sew at a 1/4 inch across this seam. Because the gusset has such a curvy curve, you may find that you need to stop and adjust your main fabric in order to keep it lying flat as you sew and not cause any puckers. Be sure to take your time on this part and go as slowly as you need to. And then there you have it, a nicely sewn seam. This part is optional, but I like to reduce bulk in the gusset by trimming the seam in half, which gives you the added bonus of cleaning up those little triangles from before and removing any threads. Flip your gusset right side out. Look at how nice it's looking. Press this with an iron to make sure that it lies nice and flat, as the seam may have gotten a bit stretched while sewing. Plus, if you have any tiny puckers, you can easily press them out at this stage. Now it's time to pin the back pattern piece along the opposite end of the gusset. In order to get a beautiful finish on both the inside and outside of the garment, however, we will need to take some extra steps. In order to do that, we need to separate out the two gusset pieces. So I'm going to put one gusset piece up like this behind the front piece, and then this one is left free. Now, with right sides together, you can go ahead and pin the back piece to the outer gusset's curved edge, just as you had for the front pieces. Now, before we sew this next piece up, what we want to do is actually use something called the burrito method, which might be a term you have heard in reference to sewing up the yoke pieces of a shirt. Basically, what we're going to do is roll our back piece like so into a little burrito. I'm rolling it towards the center. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing with the front piece so that all I can see are the gusset pieces. Then pull this part of the gusset piece down and over. Now we can take our pins and repin our two gusset pieces together with the back pattern piece sandwiched between the two. With this piece all pinned, we're going to do the exact same thing we did with the front and sew right along this edge. Once again, trim your seam if you'd like to reduce the bulk. Next up is my favorite part, which is flipping the burrito right side out. So all you have to do is pull the little burritos out and you now have basically a pair of underwear. Just a few more steps to go and we are done. So I'm going to press this just like I did this side. See how big of a difference pressing does? Look at how flat it is compared to how wrinkly this side is. But once I'm done pressing, both sides will be equally as flat. Now it's time to sew our side seams, and this part is pretty straightforward. All you want to do is match the right side to the right side of your garment at the side seams. Then we're going to pin along these side seams. You may notice that the front piece overhangs the back piece a bit at the bottom edge, and that is okay. This is part of the seam allowance as well and will disappear once sewn together. Now both sides are ready for a zigzag stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once finished, flip your undies right side out and look at that! You basically have a brand new pair of undies. So I figured right now would be a great chance to take a break, catch your breath before we move on to inserting our elastic. And while you're taking a break, I just wanted to go over a few things in regards to inserting your elastic as well as measuring yourself for elastic. With the Lavande pattern and with a lot of different underwear patterns, usually there is a guide to how much elastic you might need for your given size. However, you might find that after your first pair, it's not quite fitting you exactly the way that you had hoped. So I wanted to go over 2 methods of inserting elastic that does not require you to use the pre-cut elastic measurements found in patterns. The first one, which is the one that I used before I really felt confident enough to use more advanced lingerie sewing techniques, was simply to measure the elastic against my unique body. I would take whatever elastic I had planned on using and simply wrap it around the various points of my body, my leg or my waist or my hips, depending on where the elastic was going to hit. And I would just basically tug it until it felt comfortable against my skin, making sure that I had at least a 1/2 inch to 1 inch overlap. Then once I had my pre-cut elastic that was specifically for my body, I would follow all of the regular instructions as far as lining them up and quartering them and inserting them into the garment as a whole round unit, which is called the quartering technique, and that's the one that I'm going to be showing you all today as well. So the other method, and the one I like to use when sewing all of my elastics, is instead of measuring my elastic out beforehand and sewing it with the quarter method, which I do highly recommend to anyone who is brand new to sewing underwear. It's just a really nice and easy way to get the feel for it. But as you get more advanced, what you might want to do is the 10% method, which is stretching as you go. Basically, in order to do the 10% method, it is a lot by feel, but if it's your first time with this method, the best way to get the feel for what 10% stretch is to take a piece of elastic and stretch it from 10 inches to 11 inches. Now that feeling is just how much you want to be stretching your elastic when you are sewing. This amount of stretch is very subtle, which is why this particular method is a bit more intuitive and difficult as far as sewing it goes compared to the quartering method. But this way of sewing an elastic is a bit more precise once you get the feel for it. I use this method almost every time, and without fail, it always leads to a perfectly fitting, evenly distributed elastic feel on my garments. When sewing, you can mark your sewing machine with what the 10% stretch is, especially if you have a little casing that covers the edge right here. This can help to visually guide you the first few times you sew using this method. I always like to start with a few locking stitches, and then as I'm sewing, you don't want to stretch the bottom fabric, you only want to stretch the top. So I just stretch and sew. Every so often I will stop and stretch and sew. Stretch and sew. And it may not feel like I'm stretching very much, but 10% is all you really need to get a nice snug fit, or at least that has been the case for me. But again, everyone is different and our elastics are all different, so feel free to experiment before landing on your preferred method. To start, create a loop with your elastic by overlapping the two short ends by 1/2 inch. Pin the short ends together. We're going to end up sewing a tight zigzag stitch right along here. I'm going to do the same thing with my other two pieces of elastic as well. And when working with elastic, you might find that you actually want to swap your thread color. So even though my undies are red, my elastic is this kind of latte color. So I'm going to use a matching thread to attach it, and when we get to a future step, I will swap my top thread back to match my underwear fabric. With my new thread in place, it is time to do a tight zigzag stitch to create the elastic loop. Trim any excess elastic off as well as threads until you are left with a flat loop of elastic. Repeat these steps with your remaining elastic pieces. Next up, what you are going to want to do is quarter your elastic. To do that, simply place a pin along one of the sewn seams. Stretch it in half, and then place another pin like so. So now you have 2 pins. Then stretch your elastic in the opposite direction so that your pins kiss. You can place one on either end for the other pins. And then you're just going to repeat with the remaining elastic loops. Next, we need to quarter our waist and leg openings as well. I like to start with the waist as it is a straight line and you already have 2 pin placements along the side seams, so just place a pin along those seams, then fold it in half so that the side seams are kissing, and place another pin at the center back and then one more at the center front. For the leg openings, I like to fold them in half like this, where the side seam is touching roughly halfway between the gusset piece. So we are going to place 1 pin at the side seam, 1 in the middle of the gusset, and 1 at either folded edge here. Repeat on the second leg opening. And there we have it. We have all of our pins neatly in place, so now it's time to take our elastic and attach it, matching each of the pins up. Alright, so since we are working on the Picot elastic, I'm going to show you how to do the legs first. So what you want to do is make sure that the lace is actually facing away from the straight edge. So you want straight edge to straight edge matching. I'm going to pin the overlap right at the side seam here. So I'm just matching up pins right now, pinning it right at the edge and making sure I don't twist my elastic. As you can see, I've got the Picot elastic facing away from the straight edge. So I've got the straight edges of the elastic matched up. I've pinned it in the 4 places, and now what I'm going to do is start sewing a zigzag stitch along this edge while gently stretching the elastic so that it fits into place along the fabric. I always start off with a few locking stitches before gently stretching between my pin points and beginning to sew my elastic into place. Make sure that you aren't stretching your fabric, you only want to stretch your elastic. This part may be tricky as you might have to pull gently from both sides while lining everything up, so take your time. Then we're going to take your fabric and fold it towards the back like so. And then you're going to sew right along this edge in the same zigzag stitch, leaving just the tiniest bit of picot lace peeking through. If you want, this will be the time to swap back to your original thread color. And there you have it, one side a beautifully applied picot edging. Now as you can see, there are a few wobbles right here that indicates that my stitch length might be a little too tight for this type of fabric. So what I can do is alter that when I go to the other side, but I also think that this will easily press out. So now that I've got one side done, I'm going to move on to the other side and use the exact same methods to attach my elastic to this leg opening. With both sides complete, I'm going to give each a proper press to help relax those wobbles formed by sewing. For this part, this is a special edition of adding lace elastic to the edge. So I don't know if there's an actual proper way to do this, but this is the way that I did it and it seems to have worked out for me. So what you are going to do is line up each of your pin marks. And what's so great about this particular lace is that there is this beautifully scalloped edge with a straight lace detail that I can use to help guide my sewing. Now that it's all pinned, I'm going to sew right along this edge here on top using the same colored thread that matched this lace so that it invisibly blends together. I'm going to try my best to line up the red edge while I'm sewing, taking my time to adjust the lace as I go and giving it a slight stretch. Now, if you want, you can of course go along the inside and trim any excess that might be peeking up, especially if excess tends to irritate your skin. But look at how pretty the outside looks. You can hardly tell it's even been sewn into place. And there you have it, a perfectly sewn pair of your very own Lavande undies with a delicate edge of Picot elastic. All right, for this elastic insertion, we're going to be using fold over elastic. So I have already prepped my 2 leg opening elastics, and I'm going to show you how to prep the waist opening elastic, which is done in the exact same way. And then we're going to attach it to our undies here. So what you want to do with the waistband elastic is first determine which side of the elastic is the right side. There is usually a shiny side and a plush side to fold over elastic, and I have heard that either can be used as the right side. So since I already sewed up my 2 leg elastics with the shiny side as the right side, I'm going to continue that trend with my waist elastic as well. And I'm going to fold it in half right here and pin along the short edge. So you have a little loop of elastic with it pinned along the short edge. Next, I'm going to sew the short edge with a zigzag stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Here is what it should look like. Then go ahead and press your seam open. This helps to eliminate any excess bulk in the elastic as we are sewing it later on. For this next step, we're going to quarter not only our elastic but also our undies, so let's start with our elastic first. To do that, simply place a pin along one of the sewn seams, stretch it in half, and place another pin like so. So now you have 2 pins. Then stretch your elastic in the opposite direction so that your pins kiss. You can now place one on either end for the other pins. And then you are just going to repeat with the remaining elastic loops. Next, we need to quarter our waist and leg openings as well. I like to start with the waist as it is a straight line and you already have 2 pin placements along the side seams, so just place a pin along those seams. And then fold it in half so that the side seams are kissing. And place one pin at the center back and then another at the center front. For the leg openings, they are a little bit trickier, but what I like to do is start with the side seam and place a pin there on both sides of the garment. Then I will fold them in half like this, where the side seam is touching roughly halfway between the gusset piece. So we are going to place one pin at the side seam, one in the middle of the gusset, and one at either folded edge here. Repeat on the second leg opening. And there we have it. We have all of our pins neatly in place, so now it's time to take our elastic and attach it, matching those pins up. So I'm going to start with the waistband because it's a straight line and perfect for getting the feel of working with this sort of elastic. What I like to do is I like to sew fold over elastic in 2 steps. So this makes it a lot easier, especially if this is your first time working with fold over elastic. But as you get more confident in your sewing, you may be able to knock this process down to sewing it all in one go. But for now, we're going to start off with 2. What you want to do is pin from the inside. And if you can see, there is a little line right here. This is where you want to match up your fabric, is to this line on the inside. Slide your fabric in just like this, matching up one of your side seams with the seam in your elastic. And then simply continue in matching all of your underwear pins to your elastic pins at the center line of your elastic. As you can see, the fabric looks a little bit flimsy, and that is okay because what we're going to be doing next is stretching our elastic ever so slightly in order for it to lie flat against our fabric. And instead of sewing from the right side of your garment, we're actually going to flip it toward the wrong side and sew it from there. Then trim off any excess fabric that may have shifted while sewing. Working from the inside, I'm going to line up my zigzag stitch. I always like to do a few starting stitches to lock in my elastic. As you can see, there's a lot of gaping right here, but if I slightly pull until it is nice and flush, then I can continue sewing. This part can be quite tricky, so take your time here and pause as often as you need to adjust your fabric to be as close to the center of your elastic as possible. Now we can flip our undies right side out, and from the outside, you may have noticed that parts of the fabric have gone up and over the center of the elastic. That's totally okay. It's really difficult to get the fabric perfectly centered with this elastic. This amount doesn't bother me, so I am simply going to trim away the excess fabric so that I can easily fold over my elastic. But if it does bother you that this is uneven, you can go ahead and unpick your fabric and move it down just a tad. Now that that is all done, what I'm going to do is fold over this elastic like so, and from the front side, sew right along this edge with the sewing machine. So I am basically encapsulating all that raw edge on the inside. It'll make it look really nice and beautiful. Again, you will want to lightly stretch your elastic so that both it and your fabric are lying flat as you sew. Look at how beautiful that is. I absolutely love fold over elastic because it does look the most finished of all the elastics. Even on the inside, it looks super pretty because there's no raw edges showing through. So once you're done with your waistband, go ahead and follow the exact same steps with your leg band pieces. And there you have it, a beautiful and complete pair of your very own Lavande undies with a clean set of fold over elastic edging. For this particular view, you may find that, depending on your preferences, you may want to trim along your leg openings as well as your waistline to accommodate for your binding that is about 1/4 inch thick. For me, I'm going to leave mine as is, but if you find with your first pair that your binding is a bit too thick for you, go ahead and trim your seam allowances down anywhere between 1/4 to 1/2 inch along those edges. So I have already prepped my 2 leg opening elastics, and I'm going to show you how to prep the waist opening elastic, which is done in the exact same way. With the right side facing you, fold your fabric binding piece in half and pin along the short edge. So now you have a little loop of binding with it pinned along the short edge. Next, I'm going to sew the short edge with a zigzag stitch at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once your edge has been sewn, go ahead and trim your seam in half to reduce any excess bulk. Then we're going to press the seam to one side or the other. Next, fold your binding in half lengthwise with wrong sides touching before pressing. You should wind up with a little fabric loop that looks like so. Next, we're going to pin our bindings to our leg and waist openings, but before we do that, we need to quarter our bindings as well as our undies. Let's start with our bindings first. To do that, simply place a pin along one of the sewn seams. Stretch it in half and place another pin like so. So now that you have 2 pins, stretch your elastic in the opposite direction so that your pins kiss. You can now place one on either end for the other pins. Repeat with the remaining binding loops. Next, we need to quarter our waist and leg openings as well. I like to start with the waist as it is a straight line and you already have 2 pin placements along the side seams. So just place a pin along those side seams, then fold it in half so that the side seams are kissing. Then pin one more pin at the center back and another at the center front. For the leg openings, they are a little bit trickier, but what I like to do is start with the side seam and place a pin there on both sides of the garment. Next, I will fold them in half like this, where the side seam is touching roughly halfway between the gusset piece. So we are going to place one pin at the side seam, one in the middle of the gusset, and one at either folded edge here. Repeat on the second leg opening. And there we have it. We have all of our pins neatly in place, so now it's time to take our binding and attach it, matching those pins up. So I'm going to start with the waistband because it is a straight line, but the process is the same for all three. With the raw edge here, the non-folded edge, I'm going to place that against the top edge of the waist opening, and I'm going to start with the binding seam, matching it with the side seam here. I will then continue to match up all of my binding pins to my undies pins, making sure not to twist my binding as I go. As you can see, the fabric looks a little bit flimsy, and that's okay because what we're going to be doing next is stretching our binding ever so slightly in order for it to lie flat against our garment. I always like to do a few starting stitches to lock in my binding. As you can see, there's a lot of gaping right here, but if I slightly pull until it is nice and flush, I can continue sewing. You want to be careful not to overstretch your binding or your undie fabric. You want to stretch it just enough so that they both lie flush against one another as you sew. So you can go ahead and trim this edge if you want, but I want to make sure I have enough to stitch it down on the next step. So what you want to do is now flip this piece over so that the raw edge is hidden on the inner seam. Then we're going to stitch with just the zigzag stitch along this edge to lock it into place. And there you have it. It looks beautiful from the outside and nice and clean on the inside. If you want, you can go ahead and trim this inner seam now, then repeat the same exact steps with the leg binding on the leg openings. Finally, if your seams turned out a bit wavy, go ahead and give them a final press to smooth those waves out. And there you have it, a perfectly sewn pair of your very own Lavande undies with comfy fabric binding. Thank you all again so much for joining me on this brand new sew along video, and thank you so much if you stuck with me even through all of my technical difficulties. Being that it's been so long since I've recorded one of these things, there were bound to be issues, so I'm glad that I was able to get through it. And yeah, I'm super excited to bring you more content and more videos as the months go on. So feel free, if you really like what I'm doing, feel free to like and subscribe. And I've heard something about ringing a bell. I'm not sure what that means, but you can ring it if you want to. And I guess I will see you all next time. Bye. Oh, and an update that we got a new kitty. Say hi, boysenberry. Oh, she's a little sleepy. She just woke up from a nap. How you doing? Did you have a good nap, baby girl? Yeah? By the time this video airs, we're gonna have a third cat. So you'll have to look for him in the videos as I go.